The boy in the cornfield. When I was 8, my parents used to drop me off at my grandparents' farm every summer. It was one of those aging Midwestern plots. Wooden house with creaking steps, rusted windmill, and endless rows of corn that swayed like whispering ghosts when the wind picked up. My grandparents were kind, quiet people. Grandpa smelled like tobacco and oil, and Grandma always had flour on her hands, like she'd just finished baking something, even when she hadn't. They didn't talk much, which suited me fine. I was a quiet kid too, but the part I remember most, what's still sharp in my mind even now, decades later, is him, the neighbor boy. I never got his name. Grandpa just called him the McCleary kid, though I never saw his parents. Just him. He'd show up around dusk, always at the edge of the cornfield between our farm and the empty McCleary place. Never any closer than the scarecrow. He never walked. He just stood there, watching. At first, I thought he was shy. I waved. He didn't wave back. He was pale, too pale, with dirt-streaked cheeks and a mess of dark hair that hung in front of his eyes. Always barefoot, even when the ground was cracked and dry. He wore the same faded overalls and long, sleeved shirt every day, no matter how hot it got. Every time I asked my grandparents about him, they'd change the subject. Mind your business and stay out of that field, Grandpa said once, a little too sharply. That only made me more curious. One night, I couldn't sleep. It was hot, and the fan in my room only wheezed. So I got up and looked out the window toward the cornfield. He was there again, only closer this time, past the scarecrow, almost halfway across the field. I stared at him, and he stared back. I couldn't see his eyes, not really, but I felt them, like cold pins poking into my chest. And then he smiled. Not a kid's smile, not even a cruel one, just wrong. Like someone who had seen a smile in a picture and was trying to imitate it without knowing what it meant. I ducked under the window and stayed there until dawn. The next morning, as the sun was just beginning to rise over the cornfields, Grandma found me sitting alone near the edge of the property, my legs tucked under me, still staring into the place where the boy had been. She didn't yell, she didn't scold, but the look in her eyes unsettled me more than if she had. There was something ancient in that fear, something she had carried for years and had hoped would never awaken again. She gently took my hand, her fingers trembling slightly as they curled around mine. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was so quiet I almost missed it beneath the morning breeze. "If that boy ever speaks to you," she said, "you mustn't answer him, no matter what he says. No matter how much he sounds like someone you know. You hear me?" I stared at her, confused and afraid, and asked, "Why not? Who is he?" But she didn't explain. She just closed her eyes for a second, shook her head as if the weight of her thoughts were too much to share, and said, "Just promise me." "That's all I ask," I promised. But kids are liars when they're scared and curious at the same time. That night, when the world turned silver under the moonlight and the cornfield began to whisper again, I crept outside in my pajamas and bare feet, careful not to let the screen door slam shut behind me. The air smelled like dust and summer heat, and the only light came from the back porch bulb and the stars above. He was already there, the boy. He stood a few feet inside the rows of corn, as though he had been waiting for me. His head was tilted to one side, the same way a dog might tilt its head when it hears a sound it doesn't recognize. Curious, not threatening. His eyes were hidden beneath his mop of dark hair, but I could feel his gaze settle on me like pressure on the back of my neck. I stopped just short of the first row and called out, not knowing what I even wanted to say. "Hello," I said. My voice cracked slightly. He took a small step forward, and the corn rustled gently around him. "If I'm not supposed to talk to you," I added quickly, though I didn't back away. I should have. Every instinct told me to, but my feet wouldn't move. The boy tilted his head the other direction, and then he spoke for the first time. "Thee don't remember me," he said. His voice was dry, so dry it sounded brittle, like autumn leaves crunching underfoot. And though it wasn't loud, it cut through the stillness with unnatural clarity. "Who doesn't remember you?" I asked, my voice no more than a whisper. He lifted a thin, pale hand and pointed toward the farmhouse behind me. "Thim," he said. "Your grandma, your grandpa. They made me forget myself first. That's how it works." I felt a cold shiver crawl up my back. "That's not true," I said, trying to sound confident. "You don't live here." But he just smiled again, that same unsettling imitation of a smile that had no warmth, no emotion, like a muscle reflex performed without understanding. "I used to live in that house," he said. I had the room upstairs, the one with the squeaky fan. Grandma would let me lick the spoon after she made banana bread. Grandpa used to take me out to the shed and let me hand him tools while he fixed the old John Deere. I took a step back. My mouth had gone dry. "I think you're mistaken," I whispered. "No," he replied, calm and certain. "I remember all of it, even if they don't." He lifted his arm again, slower this time, and pointed behind him, toward the scarecrow standing in the middle of the field. "That's what they turned me into," he said, his voice hollow now. "That's what happens when you don't forget the right way." I followed his gesture. The scarecrow stood tall, its arms outstretched in a mockery of welcome. But the longer I stared, the more wrong it looked. It was taller than I remembered, too straight, its head tilted ever so slightly to the side, just like the boy's. It wore faded overalls and a dusty shirt that matched the boy's clothes exactly. A sickening realization began to bloom in my stomach. When I looked back, the boy was gone. The next morning, I told my grandparents everything, every detail, every word. I expected them to laugh or scold me, or maybe even tell me I just had a nightmare brought on by too much sugar and too little sleep. But they didn't laugh. They didn't speak at all, not at first. They just looked at each other in silence, as if something unspoken had been waiting between them for years, and now it had been forced to the surface. Grandpa's face went pale, and Grandma's lips trembled slightly as she pressed her hand over her heart. They didn't deny it. They didn't explain either, and I didn't ask again. That was the last summer I ever spent on the farm. Years passed. Life moved on. I grew up, and so did the silence around that memory until Grandpa died and the farm passed to me. I hadn't set foot there in over 2 decades. But when I returned, everything was just as I remembered it. The fields were still wide and golden. The house was still leaning slightly to the left. And the scarecrow was still there, still standing in the same exact spot, arms stretched to the sky like a silent crucifix. same clothes, same posture, but the face was different, not obviously. Subtle things, the curve of the chin, the slant of the eyes, a faint scar beneath the lip, one I'd gotten in high school after a bike crash. It was my face, that night, just after sunset. As the last light drained from the sky and the wind picked up across the corn, I saw movement at the edge of the field. A boy stood there. He was waving at me, and he looked exactly the way I did when I was 8. The deep end. When I was 11, my summer days were soaked in sun, dust, and the kind of boredom that only stretches endlessly in the countryside. My grandparents had a farm out in rural Kentucky, surrounded by fields, cows, and more silence than any kid should be left alone with. But there was one thing that saved us from losing our minds that summer: the quarry. It wasn't meant for swimming. Hell, it wasn't meant for anything anymore. It had been dug out decades before, then abandoned, filled with rainwater and runoff and God knows what. No signs, no fences, just a still, dark body of water at the bottom of a hollow, half choked with reeds and cattails. But for kids, it might as well have been paradise. There were 4 of us that summer: me, Tyler, my cousin older by a year, and the Miller twins, Caleb and Jonah, who lived on the next property over. We weren't really friends outside of summer, but out there, in the endless stretch of farmland and heat, we stuck together like wet socks. We'd race to the quarry after chores were done, tossing off our shirts, bombing into the water, laughing and shouting and daring each other to swim out to the deep end. The deep end was this black part of the quarry where the water looked thicker, somehow colder. It was where the ground dropped off and nobody knew how far down it went. Grandpa once told me an old tractor was down there somewhere, left behind when the mining stopped. Tyler said it wasn't a tractor, it was a body. Typical cousin stuff. I didn't believe him at first. The thing is, it started with dares. Everything does when you're a boy. Who can hold their breath the longest? Who can swim across without coming up? Who can touch the bottom and bring back a rock to prove it? Tyler always won. He was the fastest, the bravest, or maybe just the most reckless, until the day he didn't come back up. It was a hot, glassy day in mid-July. No breeze, no clouds, the kind of day where the air feels glued to your skin. We snuck out like always, cutting across the backfields until the ground turned rocky and the trees got dense and sharp. The water looked still and calm that day. We were already splashing around when Tyler shouted, "I bet none of you can make it to the deep end and touch bottom." I didn't want to. None of us did. Something felt wrong that day. The air was heavier. The water looked darker. But none of us wanted to back down either. So we watched as Tyler took a breath, smiled that cocky smile of his, and dove under. 1 second passed, then 2, then 10, then 20. He didn't come up. We dove after him, all 3 of us, kicking down into that thick black water, eyes wide, lungs burning. But there was nothing, nothing but cold and dark, and silt that swallowed your hands. We screamed his name. We searched until sunset. Then we ran home and lied. We said he got mad and walked off into the woods. We said we lost him. We said we thought he'd come back on his own. We didn't tell anyone about the quarry. The aftermath was worse than anything I could have imagined. The Miller twins were gone by morning, packed up and driven back to town. Their parents didn't even say goodbye. I never saw them again. Grandma stopped cooking for the first time in my life. She just sat at the table every morning, staring at the spot where Tyler used to sit, flour still on her apron but no bread rising in the oven. Grandpa barely spoke. He just smoked until his lips cracked, until the ashtray overflowed, until the porch reeked of silence and ash and grief. Posters with Tyler's face hung in the feed store window, on telephone poles, inside the church. A boy with sun, bleached hair, and a crooked smile. They all thought he was dead, but I didn't, because I kept seeing him, not clearly, just glimpses. A shadow ducking behind the barn, a figure out near the tree line, a flicker of movement in the loft that vanished when I blinked. I waited for him to come back. I don't know how much time passed after that. Time got slippery. Some days felt long, like the sun wouldn't set. Others vanished before I could even finish a thought. I wandered, always near the house, always near the fields. I'd hum songs I couldn't quite remember the words to. I'd lie in the grass and dream about things I was sure were still ahead of me, riding in a pickup with friends, holding someone's hand in a movie theater, walking across a stage in a cap and gown, things that felt real, close. I thought I was just stuck, lonely, like summer had stretched too far, like the world had forgotten to move on. But every time I got too close to the quarry, something cold would ripple through me. Not fear, exactly. More like guilt, like something buried there remembered me and didn't forgive. I missed Tyler. Missed his laugh, his stupid jokes, the way he'd always win dares and act like it was no big deal. I'd sit out on the fence and imagine what he'd be doing now if he'd made it. Whether he'd still come back to the farm for summers. Whether we'd still be friends. I'd picture him older, but I never really saw it. Like my mind couldn't finish the drawing, because Tyler was frozen in that last moment underwater, lost in the dark, and I thought about that every day. Seasons changed, years maybe. People came and went. The house got sold, then sat empty. Then someone fixed the porch, painted the shutters, but it never stayed full for long. I never left. I didn't know why. I just felt like I had to stay close, like I was waiting for something I didn't understand. And then one day, he came back, watched as the truck rolled up the long gravel path and came to a slow, hesitant stop in front of the porch. The dust settled in the air like old breath, and the door creaked open. He stepped out into the sun. At first, I didn't recognize him. He was taller, broader through the shoulders, his face lined with time and something heavier, something sorrowful. He moved like someone carrying weight that no one else could see. He stood still for a long moment, just staring at the house, our house, as though he wasn't sure he belonged near it anymore. Then his eyes flicked toward the field, toward the quarry, and something in me wavered. I stepped closer, unsure why my chest was tightening the way it was. My name, it came back to me in a whisper I hadn't heard in years. His name followed, and it hit not like a sudden punch, but like a slow, suffocating realization. Tyler. It didn't make sense at first. He wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't supposed to be alive. He was the one we'd lost. The one I'd cried for. The one whose face I thought I still saw in shadows. Whose name I repeated like a prayer when I walked the empty rows of corn and waited for something, anything, to change. But he stood there now, unmistakably real, older, worn down by time but alive. And in that moment, as I watched him shift his weight and glance toward the quarry's edge, something deep inside me cracked open like ice splitting on a frozen lake. Memories didn't come back, they surged, cold and wild and sharp. I remembered the dare, the jump, the sudden flurry of bubbles as Tyler went under. I remembered the way I kicked after him, desperate to help, the water growing darker, heavier, pulling at my limbs. And then I remembered his hand clamping around my wrist, strong and terrified, not meaning to hurt me, but doing it anyway, in that blind, panicked way drowning people do. He yanked me downward as he struggled to reach the surface, and I hit something. A rock, a jagged edge beneath the surface that met my skull with a sickening, silencing impact. And then there was only quiet. I didn't float, I didn't rise, and Tyler he must have. Somehow he got out, he lived. I staggered backward from the memory, reeling from the weight of it, and I watched as Tyler walked slowly down to the quarry, that same old familiar path worn by years and guilt. He stood at the water's edge, staring into it like it still held the answer to the question he hadn't been brave enough to ask all this time. He was holding something in his hand, a small object. His fingers trembled slightly as he looked down at it. Then he spoke. His voice cracked from disuse and something deeper, regret maybe, or shame. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't mean to. I tried to hold on. I panicked. You went still so fast. I thought God. I thought maybe I could dive again, find you. But I couldn't. I didn't. I was just a kid. I was just so scared." He stared down at the object in his palm. A necklace. My necklace. The one I wore that day. The one Grandma had given me for my birthday that summer. Leather cord. Little silver compass charm. I remembered the way it bounced against my chest when we ran to the quarry, daring each other, laughing like idiots. I watched as he let it slip through his fingers and fall into the water without a splash, like it belonged there, like it was returning home. And just like that, everything made sense. Why time never moved forward. Why the house always felt half empty. Why the air near the quarry turned cold, even in midsummer. Why no one ever saw me. Because I wasn't waiting for Tyler to come home. I was waiting to remember that I never left. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. It helps the darkness spread. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next nightmare. And remember, don't listen to the whispers in the dark.